This podcast is all about power. I sit down with Lotte Lintmeijer, who recently completed her PhD thesis. Her thesis was entitled Power in Rowing, in Search of Effective Feedback Variables. Lotte and I discuss how to properly and accurately measure power in the boat, as well as her journey to work with the Dutch national rowing team. Welcome to the Leo Training Podcast, a podcast focused on scientific and real-world expertise on training strategies between your ears, behind the oar handle, on the field and court, and in the strength and conditioning room. I'm your host, Joe DeLeo. I am a strength and conditioning coach, speaker, and lifelong student focused on continuous improvement. Thank you for joining me, and let's roll to today's episode.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me for your show. Really excited to have a chat with you.
Yes, me too. So I think that probably the best place to kick things off is, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to be interested in doing research around rowing?
Yep. So when I started to study, I studied psychology. And during my studies, I used to be a cox and a coach for a rowing club in the Netherlands, student federation. And I got more involved in rowing. And at one moment, I was coaching for about 30 hours a week, while at the same time I was doing my studies. So I decided to do my master thesis on sports and psychology. So I ended up with a master thesis in which I examined the effect of sports on anxiety and depression complaints with students. And then actually I started to work as a researcher in medical psychology, looking at inflammatory pain. And one day I saw a vacancy for a PhD on rowing, and especially on testing feedback and biomechanics in rowing. So I applied and they invited me, although I had not the right background, because they wanted to have someone with a background in science, or in how do you call that in English?
Mathematics?
Yeah, more mathematics or movement science. Okay. And I had a background in psychology, so I was absolutely not the right candidate. But they invited me, and we had a really good chat, and they liked my questions, so they asked me to provide something, to prepare something for a next interview, and to see if I could get along with the more biomechanical parts of rowing. So I had to give a presentation, and in the end, they asked me to do the job. So that's how I got involved in rowing research.
Wow, that's incredible. I have to ask, because I think that's incredibly interesting. So you started off sort of on a trajectory, almost more towards the medical field a little bit.
Yes. Yeah.
What did you find when you did some of the research around anxiety and depression regarding sports performance?
So it was a master thesis. And I had to do it in 1 year. Our question was if sports really help people, students, to reduce their anxiety and depression complaints, or whether it's more like a placebo effect. Because in the Western world especially, we know or we think that sports will help people to feel better. Or we wanted to know, is it really the sports or the exercise that helps people, or is it that they think it will help them? So, as I remember correctly, we tested people we asked people to do for 4 weeks some sports, and then 4 weeks to do relaxation exercise. And then we, every week, we asked them to fill in questionnaires on their anxiety and their depression complaints. And what we found actually was that people reduced on average their anxiety and depression complaints as much in the sports condition as well as in the relaxation condition. But what was really interesting is that we actually found that people or students who believed or had a high self-efficacy on sports, so who believed that they could do sports, reduced their anxiety during the sports exercises, during the weeks of the sport exercises. But people who scored really low on that self-efficacy scale, so who were not really sure whether they were good in sports, increased their anxiety quite a lot during the weeks that they had to do sports. Well, during the weeks that the people had to do the relaxation exercise, it was exactly the other way around.
Wow.
So it was quite a cool finding. Yeah.
Yes, that's very interesting. Very cool. Well, thank you for sharing that. Okay, so you gave a presentation, and you were selected to start some of this work. So how did you start off? Where did you begin?
So you mean with the second interview?
Yes.
They asked me to do a presentation on why a non-constant boat velocity is not efficient in rowing. Why that costs more energy than when you would have had a constant boat velocity. So I had no idea of biomechanics. I didn't knew what Newton laws were, to be honest. So I had to start from scratch, and I found someone who could help me out with some of the basic biomechanics, to help me out to make free body diagrams, and to help me out with the Newton laws. So I started there, and I read some papers on rowing, and then I gave my presentation.
That's awesome. So even though you had to start from scratch, in some ways that may have been a huge benefit, because you didn't go into it with any biases.
Yes, and I think what was really the reason why they chose me for this PhD was, well, we could get along quite good with I could get along quite good with my supervisors, but also because especially because I had a different background, and at psychology you really learn a lot about methods and statistics. Yeah. So for them that was really interesting, because that was their weak point, to say it like that. So this is the way we could really complete each other, to say it like that.
Yes, that's fantastic. That's great. Yes, very good, very good. Okay, so obviously that takes us up into how you got started on the PhD. So what was the exact title or thesis for your PhD, so that's clear to everybody that's listening?
Yeah, so my thesis in the end had the name Power in Rowing in Search of Effective Feedback Variables.
Okay. All right. And how long did you work on that? How many years?
Too long. It was planned to do it in 4 years, but I got a concussion in between, and I worked on another project as well for a few months. So in the end, it took me 5.5 years, I think.
Oh my goodness, that's such a long time. Well,
Yes.
Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
Yes. Yeah. So at the time of this recording, you just completed your defense. It's not even a month ago now, right? It's only a few weeks.
Yes, a month. Yes.
Yes. Awesome. That's fantastic. Okay. So, let's talk about power, right? And I think a good starting point for that is, what is power? How do we define that? And why is power a key factor in rowing performance?
Yeah, I think it's really good to start with a definition of power. I think before we start to talk about power output, we should make clear that we talk about the same power, because we can have, we have two different power definitions. One is the metabolic energy that a rower needs to do a certain task, and the other one, in which my research was on, is mechanical power output. So that's actually the energy that the rower transfers to the boat and the oars.
Okay. So regardless, there's two. There's the one for the actual athlete, the individual, and then there's the mechanical, which is looking at the power output of the boat. Correct? Is that accurate?
So it's both individual. So
Okay.
so actually to deliver mechanical power output, you need metabolic energy. So that's everything you eat and what's happening in your body.
Okay.
For mechanical power output is the energy that is dissipated from one object to the other object. So when we talk about power output, the delivered mechanical power of a rower, it's the power that is dissipated from the rower to the boat and the oars.
Beautiful. Got it.
Yeah?
Fantastic. Okay. So, great. We got a definition. So why is power a key factor in rowing performance?
Yeah, so let me first then define what performance is in rowing. That's also a good. We all know that the aim of rowing is to go as fast as possible from start to finish. So we define rowing performance as the average boat velocity during a race. Because the rowers or the boat that has the highest average boat velocity will win the race, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
If you look at average boat velocity and we use a biophysical framework, we can actually find out how the average boat velocity, where that comes from. So what this biophysical framework states is that a rower dissipates mechanical power output to the boat and the oars, as we've just discussed, right?
Okay.
This power output is used to overcome water drag and to create average boat velocity.
Got it. That makes sense. Yep.
But, yeah, it makes sense, right?
Yes.
But part of this power output is lost. And this is because, as we all know, rowers do not push the boat continuously. So the push off is just one phase of the oar cycle, of the rowing cycle. And the other phase, your blades are out of the water and you move your mass. So that means that the boat get different velocities during the stroke cycle.
Got it. Okay. So different velocities on the drive phase and the recovery phase.
Yes, and also in between. So it's so the boat is continuously accelerating and decelerating during a stroke cycle.
Okay.
And this non-constant velocity will cost you always more power output than when you would have had a constant velocity. And this is because power is related to the third power of velocity. Water drag will exponentially becomes bigger when the boat velocity increases. So this is the reason why power output, why a non-constant velocity is always cost you more energy than a constant velocity.
Right. Okay.
Right?
Yep.
So this is one part of the power loss of rowing. The other loss is that when the rowers put their blades in the water and push off against water, they do not only move the boat, but they also move the water around the blades.
Yeah.
And this movement of water costs energy as well. And that energy can only come from the rower. So that is mechanical power output that is lost due to water movements. So that means that actually the power output of the rower goes to three different sources. One is to the water drag, to overcome water drag and create velocity. Two, to power loss due to boat velocities during the stroke cycle. And three, to water movements around the blade.
Okay.
So in this case, so this is why power output is one of those key variables for rowing performance. Because if a rower is able to increase that power output while keeping the other factors constant, they will be able to increase average boat velocity.
Beautiful. That's what we want.
Exactly.
Awesome. Okay. So now that we have a clear definition of power as well as rowing performance, one of the things that you started to take a look at was the traditional or standard way of calculating power and how that was done. So could you tell us a little bit about that, how that method came about, and then also sort of what directions that led you to in your PhD work?
Yeah. So we just find out that power output is a key performance variable. The other importance of power output is that it's a very objective variable to control training intensity, because power output is strongly related to the metabolic costs you have when rowing. So if you increase your mechanical power output, that will cost you more energy, so it's more tiring, easily said.
Absolutely.
So it's important to get information about this power output. And the way that's done now, the traditional way to determine power output in rowing is to multiply the oar angular velocity with the moment around the oar.
Okay. So
and
oar angular velocity times the moment around the oar.
Yes. That's the traditional way of calculating power output. But if we look with more detail to that, and I can make that clear by giving you an example, we can see that this is not a correct way of calculating power output. Because, well, if you imagine yourself sitting in a single sculls on water, keeping in mind, assuming the boat to be very constant, and you don't have any oars in the boat. So you're only sitting in the boat without the oars. And then you start to move back and forwards. Then the boat will move forward and backwards, right? Mm-hmm. The boat will start to move as well as soon as you start to move.
Correct.
So that means that you overcome water drag and you create velocity.
I'm following. Yes.
Yeah, but if we now so that costs power output to overcome water drag. We just defined that in our framework. But if we now gonna calculate power output using the traditional way, oar angular velocity times moment around the oar, you will get a power output of 0. Well, that's not possible because we just moved the boat and we over and water drag was
overcome.
Yes. Yeah. So there must be a mistake in this calculation. So that was our starting point, and from there on, we wanted to find out what is this miscalculation and how can we correct it.
Wow. Okay. And how long had the traditional method been around for? How many years, and how long had it been used?
Well, actually, there are several ways to calculate power output, but they're all related to this traditional way. And actually, this traditional way is the best way because there are even worse calculations. And I found an article from 1925 where this is discussed.
Wow.
Where this calculation is described. So it's already there for almost a century.
Wow. So a very long time. Very long time.
Yes.
Incredible. Okay. So it has a pretty strong historical background in the sport. It's been around for quite some time.
Yeah.
Okay. So in working to come up with a new method, a new equation, in some ways you're gonna have to really overcome a lot of history and tradition.
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
But I think the example I just gave makes it pretty clear, intuitively clear, that there must be something wrong with this calculation. Mm-hmm. So that's an easy way to, I think, also to get more details or interest in what is getting wrong and to more understanding on, okay, there must be something wrong.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Because you would be curious to, determine how you're overcoming that velocity if there isn't oars in the boat, right? So
Exactly.
so then my next question would be is what was the next step? Where did you
Yes.
go now?
So we used Newton laws to find out what is the miscalculation in this commonly used method, and what actually is happening is if you calculate power output using the moment or the traditional way. All right, so the commonly used method, so the traditional way, is also using Newton laws, but what is happening actually is if we look at a rower, the rower applies force at the oar and forces at the foot plate, right? If he's rowing.
Correct.
Because both of those forces have a velocity, there's power dissipated because the foot plate is moving and the oar handle as well is moving. But if you calculate the moment around the traditional way, the moment around the oar multiplied with the oar angular velocity, you actually assume that the foot plate is not moving. So you say that the foot plate has a velocity of 0. So that means that you actually.
So just a question. So wouldn't the foot plate would not be moving because the seat moves. You push against the foot plate, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So you push against the foot plate. But if you look, so it's really important now to understand what your frame of reference is.
Yes.
So if you put your frame of reference to the earth, the foot plate has a velocity, and the oar handle has a velocity.
Got it.
So if you want to calculate power output, you need to take both forces into account.
Got it.
But if you put your frame of reference to the boat, the frame of reference will move with your foot plate. So the foot plate will have a velocity of 0 relative to your frame of reference, which is now the boat. So the only force you need to take into account is the force applied on the handle. And that's actually what's happening in the traditional calculation. That is that the moment around the oar multiplied by the angular velocity, the angular velocity is actually the same as the force applied at the handle multiplied by its velocity. But this is where it becomes tricky, because if you put your frame of reference to the boat, your frame of reference is moving with a non-constant velocity because the boat is moving with a non-constant velocity, right?
Right.
Still following me?
Yes.
Cool. And that means that actually Newton laws that we're using all the time are not applicable anymore.
Okay.
So to correct this non-inertial frame of reference, this non-constant moving frame of reference, we have to introduce a fictive force. So this fictive force is not really there, but we just have to put it in to make our calculations correct again.
Got it.
And this fictive force applies to the center of mass of the rower, and that center of mass and this fictive force has dissipates power output as well. So in other words, if you want to calculate the power output using the traditional way, you have to include an extra force that applies to the rower's center of mass, and that produces power output as well, in order to correct your calculation again. So if we go now back to our example where we sit in the boat, the single sculls, without our oars, and we're going to move back and forwards again, and we're going to calculate our power output now, we will still find 0 power output dissipating by at the oar, because we don't have any oars. But now we also have this fictive force applied on the rower that is moving. So the power output that is dissipated can be determined using this extra term.
Got it. Okay.
I hope you got it because it's quite difficult actually.
Yeah. No, I'm following you. Yeah, it's I was just gonna say that's a lot of work to do that.
Yes.
It's very intensive.
Well, it's easier if you have a pen and paper and you can show it with the equation, but it's quite difficult to explain it, I have to say.
Yes, you're doing a great job. You're doing a great job. So I guess the next question would be is why is it important that we use the new method compared to the more traditional one? And pretend I would be like a rowing coach. This is the way that I've always done it. Why would I be interested in doing it a different way?
Yeah, so actually, if you use the traditional way, you forget a power term, which means that you actually underestimate the actual power output that is delivered by the rower. So to compare power output delivered on the erg or on a bike with the power output delivered on water, you will find a difference. And if you're not aware of the fact the traditional way is incorrect, you do not know that the difference might come from the just a wrong calculation or a underestimation of your power output calculation. So this is the reason why I think it would be good to correct this traditional way.
Sure.
So what we did in one of our studies is to examine or to quantify this difference. So we asked several rowers, I think about 10, to row to row several trials, and we asked them during the trials to vary in their force they delivered, in their stroke rate, and in their technique. And then we calculate the power output using the traditional way and using our new method. And then we check the difference between both. And what we actually found is that if you calculate power output using the traditional way, you underestimate the actual power output of the rower with about 12.5%.
Wow. That's significant. Yeah.
That's quite significant. So at least you have to be aware that if you use the traditional way, you have an underestimation of the actual power output. But what we also found,
So I was going to ask, so if they're underestimating that, would it be accurate to say that the athletes may be actually training a lot harder than they think in terms of intensity?
Well, if you as a coach use the power output as the traditional way of calculating power output as a way to monitor training intensities, and you're not aware of that, you underestimate power output in that way, rowers might train harder than you think.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
But the interesting thing of this study is that what we also found is that this underestimation did not vary that much between rowers and the different rowing conditions. So the variation, so what we found was that if you, so we had this average underestimation of 12.5%, and the variation between rowing at stroke rate 18 or 25 was not that much. It was there, but it was not that much. So I would actually, because it's quite hard work to calculate the power output in the new method, you need a lot of new sensors, and that would cost quite some time to put them on rowers' body. So if you want to provide feedback on power output, I would just suggest to people to use the traditional way of calculating power output, but then multiply it with a factor to correct this average underestimation of 12.5%.
Sure. Okay. So you definitely have to take into account for the significant difference between the two methods.
Okay. Yes.
So with that being said, so what is the added value of measuring power output feedback compared to feedback on boat speed or boat velocity in terms of um, a training program and looking at monitoring potentially intensity or the training load for the team or the athletes?
Yeah. So I think there are a few parameters that are relevant to monitor when you want to know what kind of training intensity your rowers are training at. So one of them might be boat velocity, but the problem with boat velocity is that it is a product of all the rowers in the boat and not of the individual rower. So as a coach, if you have 4 rowers in the boat and they row at a certain velocity, you don't know which of the rowers is really what the actual training intensity is of the individual rowers.
Sure.
That's the problem with boat velocity and the problem with stroke rate, which is also sometimes used as a quantity to monitor training intensity. So then you also have heart rate. So you can monitor heart rate because that's quite a good way of monitoring the individual training intensity of the rower. But the problem with heart rate is that it's also affected by stress, for example. If you're really stressed, your heart rate is different than when you're really relaxed, or when you're tired, your heart rate is different. And heart rate is not a good quantity if you have to do high intensity trainings with short intervals, because there's always a delay in heart rate compared to what you're doing. So in that case, power output is actually the only really objective parameter to monitor and training intensity. So that's, for me at least, and I hope for others, a reason to at least monitor power output, and preferably also provide feedback on power output for rowers so they can monitor and control their training intensity while rowing.
Sure. No, that makes a ton of sense. So if a coach or an athlete or a rower wanted to monitor their power output for their training sessions, how would they go about doing that? Is there a convenient way in terms of technology now for an individual to do that, or is it still pretty complex, as you mentioned a few minutes ago, with sensors and equipment?
So I think there are some commercial parties who provide instrumented oarlocks. Sorry, those can be used to determine power output while rowing, and some of them are also able to provide feedback on that. But I have to say that they still make use of the traditional way of calculating power output. So there is still this underestimation, and there are also some other small ways of calculating power output, which makes this power output a little bit variable between different strokes. So if you want to provide feedback on power output, you can make use of those systems, but you have to be aware that the traditional way of calculating power output and that the power output is underestimated. We made a system ourselves in which we provided feedback on power output using our new method. But that's still a prototype that's used for research, and it's not commercial at the moment.
Sure. Okay. Very good. You talked about earlier what one study you did with the athletes at the different cadences, different stroke rates, and different intensities. Did that have to do with the one, or was that the study that feedback on rowers' mechanical power output improves compliance to intended on-water training intensity? Or is that a separate study?
That's a separate study, yeah.
Okay, so can you tell us about that one, please?
Yeah, sure. So at one moment we found out how to calculate power output correctly. So then we had the question, are rowers also able to comply to power output feedback if they get that feedback? And on the one hand, you can priorly say already, like, yes, sure, they are able to, because if you cycle, for example, professional cyclists always use power output as a feedback parameter, and they're pretty good in complying to those to that feedback. But in rowing, we're also rowing in crews, so our movements as an individual crew member have to be synchronous to the movements of the other rowers in the boat.
So it's more complex.
It's more complex, so you have less freedom to change your movement to adapt your power output. So there are actually two ways to change your power output. One is to apply more force during a stroke, and the second way is to increase your stroke rate. But the stroke rate is, of course, something that you have to do with all crew members in the boat. So we wanted to know whether rowers were able to comply to power output feedback. So we did a study in which we examined, in which we tested crew rowers in double 4 and 4 boats, and some double 2s. Do you say it like that?
Oh, so the double, pair, and then 4 and quad. Is that what you meant?
Yes. Sorry, I forgot the word. Yeah.
Sweep and scull. So those two.
Yes, both. Okay. Yeah, okay. We mixed everything, and we asked them for 2 training sessions to row at low intensity and medium intensity without the rowing power feedback, and in the 3rd training session we asked them to row with power output feedback. And then in all training sessions we asked the coach to provide power output targets, and we asked the rowers to comply with those power output targets. And what we found was that rowers are way better in complying to the power output targets and then the prescribed training intensities of the coach when they receive feedback on power output.
Very good. Okay.
And I think what's still interesting also to mention about the study is that it also showed the importance of power output feedback, because what we found was that when rowers did not receive the feedback, or actually that coaches prescribed power output targets that were way too high sometimes, especially during the low intensity training trials. The prescribed power output targets were way higher than what the rowers actually did in the boat. And this is actually might illustrate that it's hard without power output feedback to talk about the same training intensity. So if as a coach I ask a rower to have a low intensity, he can interpret that in different ways. Like he can interpret that to apply 100 watts, but he can also interpret it as applying 150 watts. Well, this difference can be quite big. So we have power output feedback. You can way better communicate between coaches and rowers what the actual training intensity should be.
Right. So not just providing feedback during a session and monitoring, say, their heart rate or cadence or technical, but also looking at their individual power output and having them focus on trying to adjust that every stroke and seeing how that dictates a change in boat velocity.
Yes.
Very good. Okay. So was there a particular way that it was important? Like how did the athletes get the feedback about power output? Was it just that after a piece they would, the coach would give them feedback about a reading they got on instrumentation, or was it actually in the boat and they could see it?
It was in the boat. So we have this instrumentation from Peach. So they have instrumented oarlocks, and we made our feedback system on that. And rowers had a smartphone in front of them, and while they were rowing, every stroke cycle, they saw the power output of that stroke cycle, and they saw an average, cumulative average. So after that started at 0 meters and ended after 2 kilometers. So they got 2 different power output feedbacks. One was per stroke cycle, and one was the average over a certain
distance.
distance. Thanks. Yes.
Very good. Okay. Very cool. Very cool. So what? So what was the next step after that for you and your research? Obviously, you're leading up towards the defense of your PhD, but where did you go from there after conducting that study?
Yeah, so then we knew that we could calculate power output correctly, and then and that rowers are also very able to comply with power output feedback. So actually our aim when it comes about power output as a key performance variable was reached. So then we wanted to know more about the power losses. So in the beginning I said that the rower delivers power output, and that part of the power output is lost due to velocity fluctuations and due to water movements around the blade. So there's quite less known about those power output that is lost due to water movements around the blade. So we determine power output. We know how to correctly calculate power outputs, and we know now that rowers are able to comply with power output feedback. So as I told you in the beginning, we had more key performance variables. Power output was one of them, but we also wanted to know more about the power lost due to velocity fluctuations and power loss due to water movements around the blade, and how to calculate them. Because we know already how to calculate power loss due to both velocity fluctuations, but there's not that much known about the power loss due to water movements around the blade. And without going into very much detail on that, because that's really technical, but we came up with a method, and we tested the method that can determine the power loss due to water movements around the blade.
Okay. Was there any significant findings in the with that method in learning about power loss around the blade?
So, well, it's quite technical. So I'm going to try to answer this as simple as possible. What you want to know what you need to know if you want to calculate power loss around the blade is the water force on the blade and the point of application of this water force. So you have the blade, and the water is pushing against the blade, and actually there's a point on the blade where you can calculate one specific point on the blade where you can actually calculate the net force, as it is called. So in order to determine this force, we came up with a method in which we placed or mounted strain gauges on the oar, and strain gauges can measure forces or moments on the oar. And using 3 pairs of strain gauges, we could estimate quite correctly the force of the water against the blade and its point of application. And knowing that, being able to calculate that, we can in the future hopefully determine power loss around the blade.
That's pretty intensive.
I hope you understand a little bit of that, because this is really technical.
No, it was good. It was great. Okay, so you looked at power output and then power loss. So then, just as a frame of reference, kind of how many years in were you at this point in terms of working on your PhD?
So this was so when we came with the power loss around the blade, that was year 4, I think.
Okay.
So it took us quite a while to set up all the experiments. That always costs a lot of time.
Yeah.
And especially when you do it in rowing, because you need to be, especially in on-water rowing, it's not that easy. You're not having an ergometer where you can, in a laboratory where you can collect your data and ask rowers to come there. Instead, I had to had to go to the different rowing clubs in the Netherlands, taking my stuff with me and set it up.
Yeah.
Exactly. But I got a lot of help from a lot of students, which was really, really nice. But yeah, that takes a lot of time.
Yeah. Okay. So then take us through from like you're in year 4. You finished the power loss component up until December 2019 when you successfully defended your PhD. Yeah.
Yes.
So that last year and a half or so.
Yeah. All right. Oh, this is. We had all the experiments, and I think I published the power output experiments. They were already published, and then I had to wrap up the results of the power loss experiment, the power loss around the blade, write an article on that, and then I had to write a introduction and a discussion and put everything together. And people, so if you finish your thesis, you write your thesis. At one point, it's finished. For me, it took a while to get everything together and to make a good, comprehensive and coherent story about it. And then it needs to go to some people to review it, which takes a while. And then you're allowed to defend.
Wow.
So in the meanwhile, I was already working at another company as well. So it was not 1.5 year full time.
No, of course. So, so I guess that would be a great thing to share as well. So, tell us about where you're working now and what you're doing in regards to being a data scientist.
Yeah. So now working as a data analyst, a data scientist, as a small company. The last half year I was working at a hospital in which I looked at the data of people with Crohn's disease, and was more prescriptive, like, how many men, how many women have Crohn's disease, and what are the complaints, and what are the costs, how often are they going to the doctor. And in April, I will start as a scientist at the University of Delft, the Technical University of Delft. And I will go back into sports and will work as a sports data scientist for different sport federations in the Netherlands, and maybe also some sport research as well.
Very cool. I bet you're excited about that.
Yes, I am.
Very good. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Is it any federation in the Netherlands, or will you be like assigned to specific sports, or is it your choice on what sports you want to work with? How does that work?
So what I've heard for now is that I will be working especially for the sailing federation.
Okay.
And that there will be some other small assignments, jobs for other federations as well, but the real details I'm not quite aware of.
Sure. Very good. Well, that's very exciting. Congrats.
Yes. Really looking forward. Can work with boats and water again, so that's always nice.
Yes, absolutely. So I guess to kind of wrap up, in regards to measuring power output, where do you see it going in terms of how it will impact the sport, over maybe the next like 5, 10, 15 years or so, and how it'll affect training and coaches and athletes and that type of thing?
Yes. So, well, if you look at cycling, professional cycling, we saw this rapid, that this power output feedback came up really rapidly. And actually, professional cyclists now train with power output feedback all the time. And I think they also, if they have competitions, they use the feedback as well. And I think at one moment, and I hope quite quickly, that more and more rowers will use power output as a feedback parameter to controlling their training intensity as well, and to find out what kind of power output they can deliver for 2 kilometers in order to get the best results out of the race. So I think in the next 5 years there will be more companies or more companies who provide power output feedback using instrumented oar locks, and I hope and I think that a lot more rowers will start using this power output feedback.
Very cool. Very cool.
And what I of course hope is that they will not use the traditional methods to calculate power output, but they will take into account that you have to take this extra power term as well in order to have a correct power output calculation.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, that's at the heart of your work.
Yes.
Very much so. Well, very good. That takes us through all the topics and questions. Is there anything else that you want to touch on before we wrap up?
Well, I actually have a question for you, I think.
Oh, okay.
So it's a cool question to think about what will happen in the next 5 years when it comes about feedback and rowing. So what are your ideas on this?
In regards to rowing or strength and conditioning?
Let's say both.
Okay.
Let's start with the rowing part.
Yeah, sure. I think not to piggyback off of your answer, but I think that's probably the direction that we'll be heading to get probably more individual feedback for each athlete and knowing sort of all the metrics or variables, heart rate, lactate, their power output, so that you can really dial in and measure the training intensity for the sessions.
Yes.
To me, that makes a lot of sense, especially if you have a team where you have some athletes that might be younger and some that might be later in their careers and more mature. You really want to use that as a tool to account for the training load and intensity. Especially, older athletes, it's going to take them a little bit longer to recover. And on the strength and conditioning side, I think, we're already starting to see really in the last several years, a lot more of training with velocity-based training. And there's many different kind of ways to do that. You can use, accelerometer, push bands, one company where you can put that on the individual or on the bar piece of equipment. You can use force plates. So I think looking at how the athlete is developing and expressing, force in other movements outside of their specific sport. So in this case, rowing. I think you'll start to get a much broader picture of as an individual, as an athlete, how they are able to generate and express power, whether that's in the rowing stroke, whether that's jumping, or that's running, whether that's a deadlift or a back squat or a kettlebell swing or a barbell hang clean, any of those things. And I think as you start to collect more of that information, it'll tell you what they're really good at and how they sequence and generate power, and then also kind of where you can potentially make some inroads into continuing to elevate performance. Yeah.
So I think what's also, talking again about rowing, what's important, the most important thing to include power outputs as a feedback variable and to control training intensity is also to reduce the amount of injuries, the number of injuries and the number of people that get overtrained, just because maybe the training programs are correct, but and the prescribed training intensities as well. There's a kind of a miscommunication between what the coach thinks that the rower is doing and needs to do, and what the rower himself or herself thinks what he needs to do. So in that way, I think it would be really, really good if people start to make use of power output as well. And I think even in strength and condition training, you can use. I had a student who made a application for the smartphone to determine power output during several tasks. So getting that into strength and condition would be very nice as well, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great point too. The program can be laid out the coach and the athlete have an understanding of where the prescribed intensities are, but what the coach thinks they are actually doing in terms of their output and what the athlete thinks that they're doing.
Exactly.
Maybe two different things.
Exactly.
It's super important to get some very crystal clear, objective feedback on that.
Yes.
Thank you for listening to the Leo Training Podcast. If this content is important to you, please be sure to rate and review so more people can listen. Also, you may follow me on social media, Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook to get weekly free content. For more in-depth content, please subscribe to my email newsletter at my website, leotraining.io. Be sure to check out the resources page to download free, helpful content. If you have any questions or feedback, please contact me directly by email at joe@leotraining.io or via Instagram. The handle is @leotraining. Thank you again for listening and have a great day.